Welcome back. As we mentioned last night, we heard from second gentleman Doug Emhoff, and like many others, he looked to reveal a more personal side of Vice President Harris, even poking fun at himself when he told that story about an embarrassing voicemail he left her early in their relationship. But as we learn more about Kamala Harris, the person, questions still remain about what she would be like as a president. Joining me now is Democratic Senator from Colorado, Michael Bennet. Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for making time.
We really appreciate it. Well, look, you were the first Senate Democrat to publicly say that Joe Biden couldn't beat Trump following the debate. How do you assess the state of the race right now, Senator?
I think the state of the race right now is incredible. I mean, we're sitting in a hall where Democrats are more divided than they've ever been. The excitement inside this hall, I think, is also transformational. And my hope is, and my belief is, that the feeling that's happening in this hall is a feeling that America has. I think America wants to turn the page on the last generation of political leadership. I don't think they want to go back to the chaos that Donald Trump particularly represented. Joe Biden did something incredibly patriotic that no former president has done. And now it's up to the rest of us, the Democrats that are in this hall, to make sure we deliver on what he has made possible. And I think Kamala Harris's, conduct over the last 3 or 4 weeks as the leader of our party has been extraordinary. We got to get enough of the American people to agree with us to make sure that we win this election, and I think we will.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've heard so far. The speech that we heard from the former First Lady was in many ways the headline last night, because she spoke in such personal terms. She spoke so bluntly. She spoke so plainly. And the Michelle Obama, who in 2016 had said, when they go low, we go high, she seemed to dispatch with that. I mean, the gloves were off last night. She took on Trump directly. In fact, she took on Trump more forcefully than anyone at this convention has. Do you think that's the right strategy? And should Vice President Harris adopt that, or should she leave it to the Obamas?
Well, first of all, I would say, don't tell President Obama I said this, but I think Michelle Obama gave the speech at the convention, and it wasn't just the speech of her life. It was an incredible speech. And I felt like she was letting us in to hear her critique of the politics that Donald Trump represents, the division, the hatred, the believing that only some people are entitled to be part of this country and not other people are entitled. And I think she shared that with the American people. She did us a favor by explaining from her perspective what that looked like compared to the set of values and the experiences that she was raised on the south side of Chicago by her mother right here, not that far from this hall. And I think what you saw, I think, her wrestling with was her own experience, probably, of the level of disappointment that we've had a president who is unable to embrace the kind of values that I would describe as, fundamental core American values. And now she has the opportunity basically to call it out, and I'm glad she did. She said some very important things last night.
Let's talk about what we might hear from Vice President Harris tomorrow night. She is going to give arguably the biggest speech of her life to date tomorrow night. The blanks are still being filled in terms of how she would govern. She has rolled out some economic policies. I'm told her speech is largely going to be biographical, introductory, to reintroduce herself to Americans, and it's not going to be heavy on policy. Do you think she should include some discussion of policy, though? Given this shortened timeline of the campaign, is it essential that voters find out how she would govern?
Well, first of all, this shortened timeline of the campaign, man, that may be something we want to look into. That is
You're not the first person.
It is not a bad way to run this show. But and I think it is good that she will share some of her bio because people need to know her. But look, in my mind, the economic stakes are everything here, because we're living in a country that is suffering from a set of trickle-down economics that Ronald Reagan started. And today in America, the bottom 50% of Americans have less wealth than they had in 1980. The bottom 50% of Americans own 2% of the wealth in America, and the top 10% of Americans control 75% of the wealth. That has been the result of 40 years of trickle-down trade policies, economic policies, tax policies, and that's all Donald Trump brought when he was president. More trickle down, trickle down, trickle down. Kamala Harris represents something very different. The Biden administration represented something very different. And I hope she'll talk about things like the child tax credit, something she and I worked on together when she was in the Senate and when she was vice president.
You talk about the child tax credit. Of course, President Biden couldn't get that passed through Congress. How does she get that past her other priorities?
Well, he did get it passed briefly. And briefly, we were able to tell the world that we were able to cut childhood poverty in America by 50%, that we didn't have to accept it as a permanent feature of our democracy or our economy. And I believe, look, J.D. Vance is now running around telling people he's for a child tax credit that's $5,000. When Sherrod Brown and I wrote that bill, we never would have imagined that. So maybe people are grappling with the real, the fundamental threat to our democracy, which I believe is economic immobility. Trump is a symptom of that problem. He's not the cause of that problem.
When you think about getting things done, obviously the fight is on for the Senate. I want to read you what NRCC Chair Steve Daines told NBC. He said, Senate Democrats need to pitch a perfect game to hold their majority, including in Ruby Red, Montana, and Ohio. We like our odds. You're obviously a former DSCC chair. How do you respond to that?
He might like his odds, and I understand why he's saying what he's saying. But we, in John Tester and in Sherrod Brown, we have all-star pitchers. Those guys are among the best candidates that we have ever run for the Senate. They find a way to win. The people in those states know them well.
They're not here. Should they be here?
I think they're doing the right thing, which is campaigning in their states. And they need our help. They need our help while they're campaigning in their states. John Tester and Sherrod Brown and the rest of our Jackie Rosen in Nevada, I can't go through the whole list. Our candidates are extraordinary. Their candidates, less so, to be polite. And I think as a result of that, we're going to be able to hold the majority in November.
Senator Bennet, we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.